She bumped into a mysterious stranger in a suit, but had no idea he'd fall for her at once. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The fluorescent lights of Chicago General Hospital buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across Danielle Brooks' exhausted face as she finally clocked out at 11:47 p.m. Her scrubs clung to her tired body, still damp from the sweat of a 14-hour shift that had begun before dawn. The smell of antiseptic and human suffering lingered on her skin like a second perfume, one she could never quite wash away. 29 years old, and Danielle felt ancient. Her reflection in the hospital's glass doors showed a woman who had aged beyond her years, dark circles beneath brown eyes that once sparkled with dreams, now buried under responsibility. The weight of the world pressed against her shoulders, her mother's mounting medical bills, her 17-year-old sister Maya's college applications scattered across their kitchen table, and the endless cycle of saving lives while her own slowly withered away. The November wind cut through her thin jacket as she stepped onto the sidewalk. Chicago's skyline glittering mockingly in the distance. Those towers represented a world she'd never touch, a world of people who didn't know what it felt like to choose between groceries and electricity, who didn't hold dying strangers' hands at 3 a.m. while their own hearts broke a little more each time. The L train's rumble echoed through the underground as Danielle descended the stairs, her worn sneakers squeaking against the wet concrete. Rush hour had long passed, leaving only the night shift workers, insomniacs, and lost souls riding the rails. She preferred it this way, anonymous in the dim light, invisible among the forgotten. Her phone buzzed. A text from Maya. "Mom's asking for you. Bad night." Danielle's chest tightened. The cancer was winning, despite every prayer, every treatment, every ounce of hope they'd poured into fighting it. Her mother, once the strongest woman she knew, now looked like a shadow of herself. Translucent skin stretched over fragile bones, eyes that held more pain than love should ever have to carry. The train's headlight appeared in the tunnel's darkness, and Danielle stepped forward, lost in thought. She needed to stop at the pharmacy, pick up her mother's pain medication, maybe grab some of that expensive tea Maya insisted helped with nausea. The calculations ran through her mind automatically. Rent due in 5 days, electricity bill overdue, Maya's SAT prep book still unpaid for. She was so deep in her mental arithmetic that she didn't notice the man hurrying down the platform until it was too late. The collision happened in slow motion. His shoulder caught hers as he rushed past, spinning her slightly off balance. The steaming coffee cup in his hand went flying, its contents creating an arc of brown liquid that splashed across the concrete. Something else fell too, a pair of black leather gloves that hit the ground with a soft thud. "I'm so sorry," Danielle gasped, immediately dropping to gather the scattered items. Her hands shook as she reached for the gloves, expensive, buttery, soft leather that probably cost more than she made in a week. "I wasn't watching where I—" "No, it was my fault." The voice stopped her mid-sentence, deep, careful, with an edge of something she couldn't identify. Pain, maybe, or exhaustion that matched her own. She looked up, and time seemed to suspend itself. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it. His suit was perfectly tailored, the kind that whispered money rather than shouting it, but it was his eyes that caught her. Gray-green, like storm clouds over Lake Michigan, and filled with something that made her breath hitch. He stared at her as if he'd seen a ghost or an angel. For a moment that stretched into eternity, neither of them moved. The train's brakes screeched in the distance, but all Danielle could hear was her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Something electric passed between them, something that made her skin tingle and her carefully constructed walls tremble. "Your gloves," she whispered, holding them out to him. He took them slowly, his fingers brushing hers for just an instant. The contact sent a jolt through her entire body, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of feeling something other than bone-deep weariness. "Thank you," he said, but he didn't look away. His gaze traced her face as if memorizing every detail, from the tiny scar above her left eyebrow to the way her lips parted slightly when she was nervous. The train pulled into the station with a mechanical roar, breaking the spell. Danielle blinked, suddenly aware of where she was, who she was, how utterly impossible this moment felt. "I have to go," she said, stepping toward the opening doors. "Wait," but she was already moving, disappearing into the crowded car without looking back. Through the window, she caught one last glimpse of him, standing on the platform, still as a statue, the gloves clutched in his hands like a lifeline. As the train pulled away into the tunnel's darkness, Danielle pressed her forehead against the cool glass and tried to convince herself that what just happened was nothing more than her tired mind playing tricks. But her hands were still trembling, and somewhere deep in her chest, something that had been dormant for years began to stir. Behind her, the mysterious stranger watched until the train's lights vanished completely, leaving him alone with the echo of a moment that would change everything. Julian Maddox stood motionless on the empty platform long after the train's taillights had vanished into the tunnel's mouth. The black leather gloves felt heavier in his hands than they had any right to, as if they'd absorbed some invisible weight from the woman who'd touched them. The woman whose face now burned in his memory like a brand. What the hell just happened? He'd been running late for another meaningless dinner with Victoria and her parents, the kind of obligation that felt more like a prison sentence than an engagement celebration. The merger between their families' financial empires was supposed to be finalized next month, along with their wedding. A perfect arrangement on paper, two fortunes united, two bloodlines preserved, two people who barely tolerated each other bound by contracts more than love. But when that nurse, and somehow he knew she was a nurse, could smell the faint antiseptic on her skin, had looked up at him with those impossibly deep brown eyes, everything else had ceased to exist. The merger, Victoria, the dinner, the carefully constructed life he'd built around himself like armor, all of it had simply evaporated. Julian's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, ignoring the 17 missed calls from Victoria. Instead, he found himself staring at his reflection in the black screen, seeing a stranger. When was the last time he'd felt anything? When was the last time his heart had raced for something other than a hostile takeover or a market crash? The answer came to him like a knife between the ribs. 10 years ago, before Lily died, his sister's name still had the power to stop his breathing. Lily, with her wild curls and infectious laugh, who'd been everything bright and good in their sterile, money-obsessed family. Lily, who died at 19 in a hospital bed while incompetent doctors and careless nurses let her slip away, one negligent decision at a time. Julian's jaw clenched as the familiar rage tried to claw its way to the surface. But tonight, for the first time in a decade, something else fought back. The memory of gentle hands helping him, of eyes that held genuine concern for a stranger's coffee-stained suit, not the calculated kindness of someone looking for a tip or a favor, but simple human decency. She didn't even know who I was. The realization hit him with unexpected force. In Julian's world, everyone knew who he was, heir to the Maddox financial dynasty, youngest partner in the firm's history. A man whose approval could make or break careers. People looked at him and saw dollar signs, opportunities, angles to work. But she had just seen a man who'd spilled his coffee, nothing more. His phone buzzed again. This time, a text from his father. "Where are you? The Blackwells are asking questions. Don't embarrass the family." Julian stared at the message until the words blurred. The family, the company, the obligations that had shaped his entire existence since Lily's death, when he'd thrown himself into work to avoid feeling anything real. He'd become exactly what his father wanted, a perfectly polished extension of the Maddox legacy, emotionally unavailable and strategically brilliant. But standing here in this dingy subway station, the taste of genuine surprise still on his tongue, Julian felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the ice he'd built around his heart. He found himself walking back up to street level, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete steps. The November wind bit at his face, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, replaying every second of the encounter, the way she'd immediately apologized, as if the collision was her fault, the grace with which she'd moved, despite obvious exhaustion, the wedding ring tan line on her finger that wasn't quite faded, recently divorced, maybe, or widowed. Why do I care? But he did care, and that terrified him more than any corporate battle ever had. He'd spent 10 years perfecting the art of not caring, of keeping everyone at a safe distance where they couldn't hurt him, where they couldn't fail him the way those doctors and nurses had failed Lily. Julian's steps slowed as he approached his waiting car, a sleek black sedan that screamed money in a way that suddenly felt embarrassing. His driver, Charles, looked up from his newspaper with barely concealed relief. "Mr. Maddox, sir. Shall I take you to the Blackwell residence?" Julian hesitated, his hand on the door handle. Through the car's window, he could see his reflection again, the perfect picture of success and emotional bankruptcy. But underneath, something new was stirring, something dangerous and necessary and alive. "No," he heard himself say. "Take me home." As the car pulled into traffic, Julian found himself studying every hospital they passed, wondering which one she worked at. Chicago had dozens of medical facilities, but somehow he knew he'd find her. The thought should have disturbed him. The idea of tracking down a stranger based on a 30-second encounter bordered on obsessive. Instead, it felt like the first real decision he'd made in 10 years. His phone rang again, Victoria no doubt furious about his absence. Julian looked at her name on the screen and felt nothing but a vast, empty space where affection should have been. Their relationship was a business transaction wrapped in the pretense of romance, and tonight, for the first time, that pretense felt unbearable. The gloves sat on the seat beside him, a physical reminder that something had shifted in his carefully ordered world. Tomorrow, he would have to face the consequences of tonight's absence, deal with Victoria's wounded pride and his father's cold disappointment. But right now, all he could think about was brown eyes full of genuine concern and the way his name sounded when she'd whispered, "Your gloves," like they were something precious. Julian Maddox was a man who controlled million-dollar deals before breakfast, who could read a room full of sharks and come out ahead. But one tired nurse had just brought him to his knees. 3 days had passed since the collision, and Danielle Brooks found herself unconsciously scanning every crowded platform, every coffee shop window, every face in the endless stream of Chicago commuters. She told herself it was ridiculous that mysterious men in expensive suits didn't suddenly appear in the lives of overworked nurses from the South Side. But her treacherous heart kept skipping beats at the sight of dark hair, or the sound of a deep voice calling out across the hospital corridors. "You're distracted," observed Carmen Rodriguez, her closest friend and fellow nurse, as they restocked supplies in the cardiac wing. Carmen had worked alongside Danielle for 5 years, long enough to read every micro-expression on her face. "I'm tired," Danielle replied automatically, counting gauze pads with unnecessary precision. "Mom had a rough night. Maya's been acting up about her college interviews." Carmen's tone suggested she wasn't buying it. "This is the same distraction you had after David Henderson asked you out last month, except you actually turned him down. This feels different." Danielle's hands stilled. David was a good man, a physical therapist from the 3rd floor with kind eyes and a steady job. Exactly the type of man she should be interested in. Exactly the type of man who made sense in her carefully ordered world of survival and responsibility. "Nothing happened," she said quietly. "I didn't say anything happened. I said you look different." Carmen moved closer, lowering her voice. "Oh, like someone reminded you that you're still a woman under all that self-sacrifice." Before Danielle could respond, Dr. Patricia Wells appeared in the doorway, her usual harried expression more pronounced than usual. "Brooks, I need you in Trauma Bay 3 now." Danielle's professional instincts kicked in immediately, erasing all thoughts of grey-green eyes and expensive gloves. She followed Dr. Wells down the corridor, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "What do we have?" "Motor vehicle accident. Male, mid-30s, minor head trauma, and possible concussion. He's conscious, but—" Dr. Wells paused, something flickering across her face. "He's been asking for a specific nurse." "Which one?" "You." Danielle stopped walking. "Me? Did he give a name?" "I don't recognize any recent patients who would—" "He described you perfectly, down to the small scar above your left eyebrow." Dr. Wells' expression was unreadable. "Said he met you a few days ago." The world tilted sideways. Danielle's mouth went dry as impossible possibilities crashed through her mind like waves against a seawall. It couldn't be. The odds were astronomical. Chicago had dozens of hospitals, hundreds of emergency rooms. But her feet were already moving, carrying her toward Trauma Bay 3 with a mixture of professional duty and personal terror she'd never experienced before. She pushed through the curtain and froze. He was sitting on the examination table, his usually perfect hair disheveled, a butterfly bandage across his left temple. His suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, and there was dried blood on his white shirt. But his eyes, those storm cloud eyes that had haunted her dreams, were alert and fixed on her face with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You came," he said softly, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that hadn't been there on the platform. I'm working." The words came out breathier than she intended. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Fender bender on Lakeshore Drive." "Nothing serious." He watched her approach the examination table, tracking her every movement. "I gave them your description, told them I knew a nurse here." "You don't know me." But even as she said it, Danielle was reaching for his chart, her hands automatically checking his pupils, examining the bandage on his temple, professional training warring with personal confusion. "We met for 30 seconds. 37 seconds, he corrected quietly. "And I counted." Her hands stilled against his forehead. Up close, she could see the exhaustion lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself as if expecting disappointment. This close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that made her want to lean closer. "Mr. Maddox, Julian Maddox." The name meant nothing to her, but something in the way he said it suggested it should, as if he was testing whether she would treat him differently once she knew who he was. "Well, Mr. Maddox," she said, deliberately keeping her voice professional, "let's make sure you don't have a serious concussion." She guided him through the standard neurological tests, acutely aware of his eyes, following her every movement. When she asked him to track her finger, their faces ended up inches apart, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey-green irises. "Why did you ask for me specifically?" she whispered, forgetting her professional distance. "Because," he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't identify, "you're the first person in 10 years who's looked at me like I was just human." The simple honesty in his words hit her like a physical blow. She stepped back, trying to regain her composure, but her hands were shaking. "Your tests are normal," she managed. "You should be fine to go home, but someone should monitor you tonight. Concussion symptoms can be delayed." "There's no one." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Danielle stared at this man who wore wealth like armor, but sat alone in a hospital room, asking for a stranger's care. Everything about him should have intimidated her. The expensive clothes, the careful way he spoke, the obvious gulf between their worlds. Instead, all she saw was someone as lonely as she was. "The cafeteria has decent coffee," she heard herself say. "If you want to wait around for an hour, I could check on you again. Make sure you're steady on your feet." Julian's smile transformed his entire face, erasing years of careful control and revealing something bright and desperate and real. I'd like that very much. The hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m. was a liminal space, fluorescent lit and nearly empty, occupied only by exhausted residents grabbing energy drinks and a janitor methodically mopping the far corner. Danielle sat across from Julian at a plastic table near the windows, watching him cradle a cup of terrible coffee as if it were fine wine. "This is actually awful," he said, taking another sip anyway. "Hospital coffee always is. I think they make it that way on purpose. Keeps the staff alert through sheer offense to our taste buds." Danielle found herself almost smiling, then caught herself. "How's your head feeling?" "Better." Julian's fingers absently touched the butterfly bandage at his temple. "The dizziness is gone." "Good. That's good." She wrapped her hands around her own cup, using it as a barrier between them. Everything about this felt surreal, sitting here with a man who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, not hospital cafeterias at ungodly hours. "Can I ask you something?" Julian's voice was careful, testing boundaries. "It depends what it is. The other night, on the platform, you seemed, I don't know, like you were carrying the world on your shoulders." Danielle's laugh came out bitter. "That's one way to put it. I know the feeling." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Despite his expensive clothes and obvious wealth, there was a weariness in his eyes that matched her own, a bone-deep exhaustion that money couldn't fix. "I doubt that," she said softly. "Try me." The challenge hung between them, gentle but insistent. Danielle studied his face, looking for signs of idle curiosity or the patronizing sympathy she was used to from people who thought they understood struggle. Instead, she found something that looked like genuine interest. "My mother is dying," she said bluntly, testing his reaction. "Lung cancer, stage 4. My sister Maya is 17 and brilliant, but she's angry at the world and taking it out on everyone within range. I work 14-hour shifts to keep us afloat financially, and most nights I come home too tired to be the mother figure Maya needs or the daughter my mom deserves." Julian didn't flinch, didn't offer empty platitudes or look away in discomfort. He just nodded, as if she'd told him something he already understood. "How long does your mother have?" "The doctors say months, maybe weeks." The words came easier than she expected. "Maya doesn't want to talk about it. She's convinced that if we don't acknowledge it, maybe it won't happen." "And you're holding everyone together?" "Trying to." Danielle's voice cracked slightly. "Some days I feel like I'm failing at everything, like I'm not enough for any of them." "You are enough." The certainty in Julian's voice surprised her. "More than enough. You don't know me." "I know enough." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I know you work yourself to exhaustion taking care of strangers. I know you immediately apologized when I ran into you, even though it was my fault. I know you agreed to sit here with someone who's essentially a stranger because you could see he needed company." Heat crept up Danielle's neck. "Your turn." "What?" "You said you knew the feeling of carrying the world. So what's your world like?" Julian was quiet for so long that Danielle thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I lost my sister 10 years ago. She was 19 in college, had her whole life ahead of her. Got pneumonia, went to the hospital." He stopped, his jaw working. The doctors misdiagnosed her. The nurses were overworked, understaffed. By the time anyone realized how serious it was too late. Danielle's breath caught. "Julian, I blamed everyone, the hospital, the staff, the system, but mostly I blamed myself for not being there when she needed me." His hands clenched around the coffee cup. "I threw myself into work after that, built walls so high that nothing could touch me, haven't let anyone close since—" "Until 3 nights ago," Danielle said quietly. He looked up, startled by her perceptiveness. "Until 3 nights ago. Why me? I don't know." The admission seemed to cost him something. "Maybe because you didn't see Julian Maddox, heir to a financial empire. You just saw someone who spilled coffee." "You're an heir to a financial empire." His laugh was rueful. "You really don't know who I am. Should I? Most people in Chicago would recognize the name. Maddox Financial Group. We manage portfolios for half the city's elite." Danielle felt something cold settle in her stomach. The distance between their worlds suddenly felt vast and unbridgeable. "Oh, don't do that." "Do what?" "Pull away from me because of money I didn't earn and don't particularly want." "It's not about the money. It's about—" She gestured helplessly. "You live in a different universe than I do. You probably have people whose job it is to make sure you never have to sit in hospital cafeterias drinking terrible coffee." "I do," Julian admitted, "and I've never been more grateful to be somewhere in my life." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tight. "This is complicated. Most worthwhile things are." Before Danielle could respond, her pager buzzed. She glanced down at it and sighed. "I have to get back." "Of course." Julian stood as she did, and for a moment they faced each other awkwardly, neither sure how to end this strange, honest conversation. "Julian," she said finally, "I'm glad you're okay. From the accident, I mean." "Danielle," he said, and her name sounded different on his lips, careful, precious. Could I see you again? Outside of emergency rooms and cafeterias?" She should say no. Should explain all the reasons why a relationship between them was impossible, should protect her heart from another inevitable disappointment. Instead, she heard herself say, "I get off work Thursday at 7. His smile was worth the risk. Thursday evening found Danielle standing in front of her bedroom mirror, holding up 2 different sweaters and feeling ridiculous. She'd changed clothes 3 times, torn between wanting to look nice and refusing to pretend she was someone she wasn't. The navy blue cardigan was professional, safe, the kind of thing she wore to parent-teacher conferences for Maya. The burgundy sweater was softer, more feminine, but it felt like putting on armor she didn't know how to wear. "Just pick one," Maya called from the doorway, startling her. At 17, her sister moved through the world with the fluid confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned that life could break you in half without warning. "You look good in both." "I'm not trying to look good," Danielle lied, settling on the burgundy. "It's just dinner, with the guy who sent flowers." Maya's voice carried a teasing note that reminded Danielle of who her sister had been before their mother got sick, playful, optimistic, full of dreams that hadn't yet been tempered by reality. The flowers had arrived that morning, a simple bouquet of white lilies that had made Danielle's heart stop for reasons she couldn't explain. The card had read only, "Looking forward to tonight." Ajee, no expensive arrangements, no overwhelming display of wealth, just something quiet and thoughtful that had made her mother smile for the first time in weeks. "Lilies were your father's favorite," her mother had whispered from her bed, her voice thin but wistful. "He used to bring them to me when we were dating." Now, as Danielle checked her reflection one more time, she wondered if Julian had chosen them deliberately, or if it was just coincidence. Either way, the flowers sat on their kitchen table like a promise she wasn't sure she was ready to keep. The restaurant Julian had chosen surprised her. Instead of some expensive downtown establishment, he'd suggested Rosario's, a family-owned Italian place in Lincoln Park that felt warm and unpretentious. She arrived first, her nerves jangling, and was shown to a corner table near windows that overlooked the park. When Julian walked in, her breath caught. He wore dark jeans and a grey sweater that made his eyes look like lake water in winter. Without the armor of his expensive suit, he looked younger, more approachable, more human. "You found it okay?" he asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "GPS is a wonderful thing." She accepted the menu from their waitress, grateful for something to do with her hands. "This place is lovely. How did you know about it?" "I used to come here with Lily." The admission came quietly, as if he hadn't meant to share it. She loved their tiramisu, said it was the only thing that could make her forget about calculus exams. Danielle looked up from her menu, studying his face. "Does it hurt, being here?" "I thought it would." Julian's fingers drummed against the table. "But it doesn't. It feels right, somehow. Like she'd approve." They ordered chicken parmigiana for her, seafood risotto for him, and fell into conversation that flowed easier than it had any right to. Julian asked about Maya's college applications and listened intently as Danielle described her sister's dreams of studying environmental science. When she mentioned the financial aid applications keeping her up at night, he didn't offer to help with money, which she appreciated more than he probably knew. What was she like? Danielle asked as they shared the famous tiramisu. Lily. Julian's smile was soft, genuine, stubborn, brilliant. She wanted to save the world through renewable energy research. Used to lecture me about my carbon footprint every time I took the company jet. He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. She would have liked you. How can you be sure? Because she always said I needed someone who would call me on my bullshit. His eyes met hers across the candlelit table. Someone who wouldn't be impressed by the money or intimidated by the family name. Maybe she was right. About calling me on my bullshit? About what you needed. The words hung between them, heavier than she'd intended. Julian set down his fork, his expression suddenly serious. Danielle, there's something you should know about my family, about the expectations. You're engaged. The words slipped out before she could stop them, and Julian's face went white. How did you... Your ring finger. There's a tan line. She forced herself to meet his eyes, even as her heart cracked. I'm not stupid, Julian. Men like you don't stay single at 35 unless there's a reason. It's not what you think, isn't it? She reached for her purse, suddenly desperate to escape. This was a mistake. I should have known. Victoria and I aren't in love. The words came out rushed, desperate. It's a business arrangement, has been from the beginning. Our families... Have I mentioned I call people on their bullshit? Danielle's voice was sharper than she intended. Because that sounds like exactly the kind of thing someone says when they want to have their cake and eat it too. Julian's hands flat on the table, his knuckles white. The engagement is ending. I called it off yesterday. The restaurant seemed to go quiet around them. Danielle stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception and finding only raw honesty. Why? Because 37 seconds on a subway platform showed me what I've been missing for 10 years. His voice dropped to a whisper. Because I'd rather have one real moment with you than a lifetime of pretending with someone else. Danielle's hands trembled as she set down her napkin. Outside the window, couples walked through the park under streetlights, their lives simple and uncomplicated in ways hers would never be again. This is terrifying, she whispered. I know. You could destroy me. You could save me. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were brave enough to cross. The weeks that followed their dinner at Rosario's felt like living in a bubble that could burst at any moment. Julian appeared in Danielle's life with the quiet persistence of rain, not overwhelming, but constant enough to change the landscape of her days. He brought coffee to the hospital during her breaks, learned Maya's class schedule so he could offer rides when Danielle was working late, and somehow managed to make her mother laugh during his carefully timed visits. He's good for you, her mother, Patricia, observed one evening as Danielle helped her with her medication. The cancer had stolen so much, her strength, her appetite, her ability to sleep through the night, but it hadn't touched the sharpness in her eyes when it came to reading her daughter's heart. It's complicated, Mama. The best things usually are. Patricia's fingers, thin as bird bones, closed around Danielle's hand. Your daddy and I came from different worlds too. His family thought I was too poor, too young. My family thought he was too good to be true. Were they right? About him being too good to be true. Patricia's smile was soft with memory. No, baby. Sometimes the universe surprises you with exactly what you need, even when you're not looking for it. But the universe, Danielle was learning, had a cruel sense of timing. The very next day, as she was updating patient charts in the cardiac wing, Carmen appeared at her shoulder with an expression that meant trouble. We need to talk, Carmen said quietly. Break room. Now. Danielle followed her friend down the corridor, her stomach already knotting with dread. Carmen only used that tone when something was seriously wrong. I did some research on your mystery man, Carmen said once they were alone, pulling out her phone. Julian Maddox. heir to Maddox Financial Group, worth about $800 million, recently called off his engagement to Victoria Blackwell, which, by the way, made the society pages because her family is apparently furious about the broken merger. Carmen, I'm not done. Carmen's fingers swiped across her screen. Here's the part you need to see. She held up her phone, showing a news article from 10 years ago. The headline read, "Medical malpractice suit settled. Maddox family receives $15 million after daughter's wrongful death." Danielle's blood turned to ice as she read the article. Lily Maddox, 19, had died at Northwestern Memorial Hospital after a series of medical errors led to her pneumonia being misdiagnosed as a minor respiratory infection. The family had sued the hospital, 3 doctors and 2 nurses. The settlement had been one of the largest malpractice awards in Chicago history. Danielle, Carmen's voice was gentle now, worried. Northwestern Memorial, that's where you did your residency. The article mentions the cardiac wing specifically. The phone slipped from Danielle's numb fingers. Northwestern Memorial. She'd spent 2 years there, learning her craft, working under some of the best cardiologists in the city. The timeline fit perfectly. She would have been there when Lily Maddox died. "I need to check something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. 20 minutes later, she sat in the hospital's records department, staring at a personnel file that confirmed her worst fears. During her residency at Northwestern, she'd been assigned to the cardiac wing from September 2014 through August 2016. Lily Maddox had died in February 2015. Danielle's hand shook as she cross-referenced the duty rosters. There it was, in black and white. She'd been on shift the night Lily was admitted, not assigned to Lily's case directly, but working the same floor, the same corridors where Julian's sister had fought for her life and lost. The room spun around her. Had she passed Lily in the hallway? Had she been one of the overworked, understaffed nurses Julian blamed for his sister's death? The memory came back in fragments. A busy night, multiple emergencies, the controlled chaos of a teaching hospital. She remembered a young woman with dark curls, remembered thinking she looked too pale, but she'd been assigned to other patients, following protocol, trusting that someone else was handling the case, someone else who had failed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Julian. "Dinner tonight. I know a place that makes better tiramisu than Rosario's." Danielle stared at the message until the words blurred. How could she face him knowing what she knew now? How could she sit across from him and pretend that she hadn't been part of the system that had failed his sister? Even if she hadn't been directly responsible, she'd been there. She'd been one of the faces in scrubs that represented everything he'd learned to hate and fear. Her fingers trembled as she typed back, "Can't tonight, work emergency." It was a lie, but she needed time to think, needed to figure out how to tell him the truth without destroying whatever fragile thing they'd built between them. But as she sat in the sterile records room, surrounded by files that documented both healing and failure, Danielle realized there might be no way to tell him that wouldn't end everything. Julian had trusted her with his deepest pain, had allowed her into the sacred space of his sister's memory, and she was connected to the very place and time that had stolen Lily from him. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. The man who'd blamed nurses for his sister's death had fallen in love with one. The woman who'd spent her career saving lives had been present during one of the most devastating losses of his. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Julian. "Is everything okay? You seem distant lately." Everything was not okay. Everything was falling apart, one revealed truth at a time, and Danielle had no idea how to put it back together without losing the first real love she'd ever known. The secret sat in Danielle's chest like a tumor, growing heavier with each passing day. 2 weeks had crawled by since she'd discovered the truth about Lily's death, and the weight of it was slowly crushing everything good that had bloomed between her and Julian. She found herself pulling away in tiny increments, arriving a few minutes late to their coffee dates, cutting their phone conversations short, avoiding his eyes when he talked about his sister. Julian noticed. Of course he noticed. "You're different," he said one evening as they sat in his car outside the hospital after her shift. Rain drummed against the windshield, creating a cocoon of intimacy that only made her guilt worse. Distant, like you're already halfway out the door. "I'm tired," she lied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Mum's been having more bad days." It wasn't entirely false. Patricia's condition was deteriorating rapidly, the cancer spreading like spilled ink through her body. But that wasn't what was eating at Danielle's soul. That wasn't what made her feel like a fraud every time Julian touched her hand or smiled at her with those storm-grey eyes full of trust. "Is there anything I can do?" Julian's voice was soft with concern. "Any way I can help?" The genuine care in his voice nearly broke her. Here was a man who'd opened his carefully guarded heart, who'd risked everything by ending his engagement, who looked at her like she was something precious and rare, and she was lying to him about the most important thing in his life. "No," she whispered. "There's nothing anyone can do." Julian reached across the console to take her hand, and she forced herself not to pull away, even though his touch felt like a brand against her skin. "You don't have to carry everything alone, you know. I'm here. Whatever you need." The words were a knife between her ribs. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to explain that she'd been there that night, that she remembered the chaos and fear, that she'd wished 1,000 times she could have done something different. But the thought of watching love die in his eyes, of seeing him realize that she was part of the system that had failed Lily, paralyzed her. "I know," she said instead, and hated herself for the lie. The next morning brought new complications. Danielle was updating patient charts when Dr. Wells approached with a grim expression and a thick manila folder. "I need to talk to you about the Hernandez case," Dr. Wells said, but her tone suggested this wasn't really about their current patient. They walked to a quiet alcove near the elevators, away from the bustle of the nursing station. "Doctor." Wells opened the folder, revealing printouts of news articles and legal documents. "Someone's been asking questions about you," Dr. Wells said quietly, "specifically about your time at Northwestern Memorial. HR got a call yesterday from a private investigator." Danielle's blood turned to ice. "A private investigator?" "He was asking about your employment history, your performance reviews, any incidents or complaints. I told them to direct all inquiries to our legal department, but..." Dr. Wells studied Danielle's face carefully. "Is there something I should know? Something from your residency that might come back to bite us?" "No," Danielle said quickly. Too quickly. "Nothing like that. I was a good resident, never had any major incidents." It was true, technically. She'd been a model resident, hard-working, conscientious, well regarded by her supervisors. But the timing of the investigation couldn't be coincidental. Someone was digging into her past, and she had a sinking feeling she knew who. That evening, she stood outside Julian's downtown apartment building, her hands shaking as she rehearsed what she needed to say. The building was everything she'd expected, sleek glass and steel that reached toward the sky like a monument to wealth. The doorman looked at her with the polite skepticism reserved for people who clearly didn't belong, in such rarefied air. "Danielle Brooks to see Julian Maddox," she told him, her voice steadier than she felt. The ride up to the 40th floor felt endless. When the elevator doors opened directly into Julian's penthouse, she wasn't surprised by the understated luxury, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, the artwork that probably cost more than her annual salary, the furniture that whispered money without shouting it. What surprised her was Julian himself, standing in the middle of it all looking lost and hollow-eyed. "You hired a private investigator," she said without preamble. It wasn't a question. Julian's face went pale. "Danielle, to investigate me, my background, my time at Northwestern." Each word felt like swallowing glass. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" She set her purse down on his marble entryway table with deliberate care. "What exactly did you think you'd find, Julian? Some dark secret that would explain why I've been pulling away?" "I was worried about you. You've been different, distant, and I thought—" He ran his hands through his hair, destroying its usual perfect order. "I thought maybe someone was threatening you, or there was something in your past that was causing you pain. So you decided to dig into my life without asking. I wanted to protect you. From what? From whatever was making you look at me like you were afraid." Julian took a step toward her, his voice breaking. "Like you were waiting for me to hurt you." The accusation hung between them, and Danielle realized with sick clarity that he wasn't entirely wrong. She had been waiting for him to hurt her, waiting for him to discover the truth and walk away. But she'd never expected him to go looking for it himself. "What did you find?" she asked quietly. "Nothing. That's the point. Clean record, exemplary performance reviews, not even a parking ticket." His laugh was bitter. Which only made me more convinced that something was wrong, because people don't change the way you've changed without a reason." Danielle closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settling around them like a shroud. He'd been so close to the truth, his investigator digging through her employment records, probably just missing the connection by days or weeks. And now here they stood, both wounded by secrets and suspicion, their trust fractured beyond easy repair. "But there is something," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet his. "Something I should have told you weeks ago." Julian went very still. "What?" "I was there, Julian. The night your sister died. I was working at Northwestern Memorial." The silence that followed Danielle's confession was deafening. Julian stood frozen in the middle of his penthouse, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for her to track. Shock, disbelief, something that might have been betrayal. The city lights beyond his windows blurred as tears gathered in her eyes, but she forced herself to keep looking at him, to witness the moment she destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her. "You were there," he said finally, his voice hollow. It wasn't a question. "Yes, that night. February 18th, 2015. The date rolled off his tongue like a prayer he'd memorized. "You were working the cardiac wing when my sister—" "I wasn't her nurse." The words came out rushed, desperate. "I wasn't assigned to her case. I was covering other patients, following protocol." "But you knew." Julian's voice was getting louder, sharper. "You knew who she was. You knew what happened to her." "Not at first. Not when we met. I only found out 2 weeks ago when Carmen showed me the articles." 2 weeks? The words exploded out of him. "You've known for 2 weeks and you said nothing." "Julian, please. 2 weeks of letting me talk about her, of watching me trust you with her memory, of letting me—" He stopped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Christ, I told you about how the nurses failed her. I told you how I blamed them, and you sat there knowing you were one of them. I tried to tell you— When? When exactly did you try to tell me?" His laugh was bitter, dangerous, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me since the day we met. That's not fair." Danielle's own voice was rising now, fueled by weeks of guilt and the desperate need to make him understand. "I didn't know who you were when we collided on that platform. I had no idea about Lily until Carmen. But you knew when you agreed to have coffee with me. You knew when you let me kiss you. You knew when I called off my engagement for you." Each accusation hit like a physical blow. "You knew, and you let me fall in love with someone who was part of the system that killed my sister." The words hung in the air between them, ugly and final. Danielle felt something break inside her chest, a clean snap like a bone, giving way under too much pressure. "You think I wanted this?" she whispered. "You think I enjoyed lying to you? Do you have any idea what it's been like? Knowing that I might have passed her in the hallway that night, wondering if I could have done something different, said something that might have—" "Stop!" Julian's voice was ice. "Don't you dare make this about your guilt. Don't you dare try to make me comfort you about this. I'm not asking for comfort. I'm trying to explain—" "Explain what? How you manipulated me. How you let me open my heart to someone who represents everything I've spent 10 years trying to forget. I never manipulated you." The accusation stung because it hit too close to a fear she'd carried for weeks. "I fell in love with you too, Julian. I fell in love with you, And it terrified me because I knew this moment would come. I knew that eventually you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now. How am I looking at you? Like I'm the enemy." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his breathing heavy in the silence. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer but somehow more devastating. "I trusted you," he said quietly. "For the first time in 10 years, I let someone past my defenses. I thought you were different. I thought you saw me as more than just another rich guy with daddy issues. I do see you. No, you don't. You see someone you can fix. Someone whose trauma you can heal with your nurse's training and your gentle hands and your sad eyes." His smile was cruel. "But you can't fix this, Danielle. You can't bandage this wound because you're part of what caused it." The words hit her like a slap. "That's not what this is. What we have isn't about me trying to fix you, isn't it? The broken billionaire and the saint in scrubs. It's quite a story." "Stop it!" Tears were flowing freely now, but she didn't wipe them away. "You're being cruel because you're hurt. But don't you dare diminish what we've had. Don't you dare pretend that every moment between us was a lie. Wasn't it?" Julian moved to the window, putting distance between them. "Thus every conversation where I talked about Lily, every time I told you how much I hated hospitals and doctors and nurses, you sat there knowing you were exactly what I was describing. I sat there falling in love with a man who was so much more than his anger, a man who made me feel alive for the first time in years, a man who looked at me like I mattered. You did matter." The admission came out broken, reluctant. "That's what makes this so much worse." Danielle moved toward him, her hand outstretched, but Julian stepped back as if her touch would burn him. "Don't," he said quietly. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." "So that's it. 10 years of trauma and 2 weeks of lies, and you're just going to throw away everything we've built." "What exactly have we built, Danielle? A relationship based on deception? A love story where one person has been lying since the beginning? I haven't been lying about loving you." "No," Julian said, his voice soft and final, "but you've been lying about everything else, and I can't look at you without seeing that hospital, without wondering if you walked past her room that night, without remembering that you're part of the system that failed her." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. After everything they'd shared, every wall he'd torn down, every piece of his heart he'd given her, it all came down to this. She would always be the nurse who was there the night his sister died, and he would always be the man who couldn't forgive the very profession that defined her. "I should go," she whispered. Julian didn't argue, didn't try to stop her. He just stood by the window, silhouetted against the city lights, looking like the loneliest man in the world. Danielle picked up her purse with hands that shook like autumn leaves and walked toward the elevator. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I would have done anything to save her. If I had known, if I had been assigned to her case, I would have moved heaven and earth to keep her alive, because that's who I am, Julian. That's who I've always been." The elevator doors closed on his silence, carrying her down and away from the only love she'd ever known. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. 3 weeks passed in a haze of purposeful numbness. Julian threw himself into work with the single-minded intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. 18-hour days became the norm. Board meetings blurred into conference calls, and he consumed spreadsheets and market analyses like they were oxygen. Anything to avoid the silence of his penthouse, where her absence echoed in every corner. Victoria had made several attempts to reconcile, appearing at his office with strategic tears and carefully rehearsed speeches about forgiveness and second chances. His father called daily, alternating between fury about the broken merger and manipulative concern about Julian's emotional instability. The family lawyers were having fits about the financial implications of the cancelled engagement. Julian ignored them all, but he couldn't ignore the dreams. Every night, Lily appeared to him as she had been in life, 19 years old, brilliant and stubborn, with wild curls and eyes that sparkled with mischief. In the dreams, she sat on his hospital bed like she used to when they were children, swinging her legs and lecturing him about everything he was doing wrong. "You're being an idiot," Dream Lily said one particularly vivid night. "A spectacular, grade-A, titanium-plated idiot." "She lied to me," Julian argued, the words feeling hollow, even in sleep. "Or she was there when you died, and she lied to me about it. She was a resident who wasn't even assigned to my case." Lily's voice carried the exasperated patience she'd always used when explaining obvious things to him. "And she fell in love with you despite knowing you blamed people like her for what happened to me. If anything, that makes her braver than you. She should have told me." "When? The first time you met and spilled coffee on each other?" "Hi. Nice to meet you. I was working the night your sister died. Or maybe during your romantic dinner, when you were busy falling apart about your tragic past." Lily rolled her eyes in that distinctly teenage way that made Julian's chest ache. "She was protecting both of you from exactly what happened when you found out. I had a right to know. You had a right to heal." Lily's expression softened. "And so did she. Julian, what happened to me wasn't her fault. It wasn't even really anyone's fault. Sometimes the system fails, sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes terrible things just happen, but you've been carrying this anger for 10 years, and it's eating you alive." Julian woke from these dreams, feeling more exhausted than when he'd gone to sleep, Lily's words echoing in his mind like accusations he couldn't escape. He tried to dismiss them as guilt-induced hallucinations, his subconscious attempting to process the emotional devastation of the past month, but the doubts had taken root. On a grey Thursday morning, exactly 4 weeks after their confrontation, Julian found himself standing outside Chicago General Hospital. He told himself he was there to finally retrieve some business documents from a client meeting, but the excuse felt thin even to him. The truth was simpler and more devastating. He missed her with an intensity that felt like physical pain. He didn't plan to seek her out, didn't plan to do anything except walk through the lobby and prove to himself that he could be in the same building without falling apart. But as he passed the cardiac wing, he caught sight of a familiar figure through the glass doors. Danielle looked terrible. Thinner than he remembered, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and too much coffee. She moved through the hallway with mechanical precision, her usual grace replaced by the hollow efficiency of someone going through the motions of living. When she smiled at a patient, the expression didn't reach her eyes. "She's been like that for weeks," a voice said behind him. Julian turned to find an older woman in scrubs watching him watch Danielle. Her name tag read Carmen Rodriguez, RN, and her expression was distinctly unfriendly. "You must be the famous Julian Maddox," Carmen continued, her tone dripping with disapproval. "The man who broke my friend's heart." "I didn't," Julian started, then stopped, because he had broken her heart, deliberately and cruelly, and no amount of justification would change that fact. "Do you know what she told me after that night?" Carmen stepped closer, her voice low and intense. "She said she understood why you reacted the way you did, that she didn't blame you for hating her, that she hoped someday you'd find peace." Each word hit like a physical blow. "Carmen, I'm not done." Carmen's eyes blazed with protective fury. "That woman has spent her entire adult life saving people. She works 16-hour shifts, sends most of her paycheck to cover her mother's medical bills, and still finds time to volunteer at the free clinic on weekends. She's the best nurse I've ever worked with, and one of the kindest people I've ever known. And you destroyed her because she couldn't figure out how to tell you something that would hurt you both. You don't understand. I understand plenty. I understand that your sister died in a hospital, and that's terrible. I understand that you needed someone to blame, and that's human. But I also understand that Danielle wasn't responsible for what happened to Lily, and punishing her for existing in the same profession as the people who failed your sister is cruel and unfair." Julian watched through the glass as Danielle checked on an elderly patient, her movements gentle despite her obvious exhaustion. The patient's face lit up when she spoke, and for just a moment, Danielle's real smile broke through, warm and genuine and heartbreakingly beautiful. Her mother died last week, Carmen said quietly, and Julian's world tilted sideways. What? Patricia Brooks passed peacefully in her sleep on Tuesday. Danielle held her hand the whole time. Carmen's voice softened slightly. The funeral is tomorrow. I thought you should know. The information hit Julian like a sledgehammer to the chest. While he'd been wallowing in self-righteous anger, nursing his wounded pride and 10-year-old trauma, Danielle had been watching her mother die. The woman who'd raised her, who'd given her strength and wisdom and unconditional love, gone, while Julian had been too busy being cruel to offer comfort. Where? He whispered. Carmen studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether he deserved the information. Finally, she sighed. Graceland Cemetery, 2 o'clock. Julian nodded, his throat too tight for words. Through the glass, Danielle disappeared around a corner, and he felt the loss like a physical wound. Tomorrow, he would stand at the grave of a woman he'd barely known but deeply respected, and he would try to find the courage to ask forgiveness from the daughter who'd loved her. He would try to find the words to explain that his anger had never really been about Danielle at all. It had been about his own guilt, his own failure to save the person who'd mattered most. He would try to find a way to honor both the sister he'd lost and the woman he'd loved and destroyed. Graceland Cemetery stretched out under a pewter sky, its ancient trees standing sentinel over generations of Chicago's departed. Julian arrived early, parking his car along the winding path and walking among the weathered headstones until he found the small gathering near a freshly dug grave. He kept his distance, standing beneath an old oak tree where he could see but not intrude. Danielle stood between Maya and Carmen, wearing a simple black dress that made her look impossibly fragile. Her face was composed but hollow, the kind of emptiness that came after tears had been exhausted. Maya clung to her sister's arm, 17 years old and suddenly orphaned, her usual teenage bravado replaced by raw grief. The service was small and intimate. Perhaps 20 people who had known Patricia Brooks not as a patient or a case number, but as a woman who had raised 2 daughters with grace and courage, despite impossible circumstances. Julian listened as friends shared memories of Patricia's laughter, her fierce protectiveness, her ability to find hope in the darkest moments. When Danielle stepped forward to speak, her voice carried across the cemetery like a prayer. My mother taught me that healing wasn't just about medicine, she said, her words steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. She said that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply to see them, really see them, and remind them that they matter, that they're not alone. Julian's chest tightened as he recognized the echo of those words in every interaction he'd had with Danielle. The way she'd looked at him on the subway platform, really seen him beneath the expensive suit and careful armor. The way she'd reminded him that he was human, that he was worth loving. She also taught me about forgiveness, Danielle continued, her gaze finding Julian across the cemetery. For a moment, their eyes met, and he saw not anger or resentment, but a sadness so deep it took his breath away. She said that holding on to hurt was like drinking poison and hoping someone else would get sick, that sometimes you have to let go of the pain, not for the person who caused it, but for yourself. The words hit Julian like absolution and accusation combined. He realized she wasn't just eulogizing her mother, she was offering him a bridge back from the wasteland of his own making. As the service concluded and people began to disperse, Julian remained beneath the oak tree, uncertain whether he had the right to approach. It was Maya who noticed him first, her eyes widening with recognition before narrowing with protective anger. "What is he doing here?" she asked Carmen loudly enough for Julian to hear. Danielle turned, and Julian saw her face cycle through surprise, pain, and something that might have been hope, before settling into careful neutrality. "It's okay," she told Maya quietly. "Give me a minute." Carmen shot Julian a warning look before guiding Maya toward the parking area, leaving Danielle and Julian alone among the graves and growing shadows. They faced each other across 10 feet of sacred ground, Two people who had loved deeply and lost catastrophically, who had wounded each other in ways that felt irreparable. "I'm sorry," Julian said finally, the words inadequate but necessary. "About your mother. About not being here when you needed." His voice broke. "About everything." Danielle nodded slowly, wrapping her arms around herself against the October chill. "She liked you, you know. Said you reminded her of my father, stubborn and proud, but with a good heart buried underneath all the walls. Was she right about the good heart?" "I thought so. Once." Danielle's smile was sad and distant. "But I've been wrong about people before." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of all their unsaid words hanging between them like fog. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the black leather gloves, the ones she'd retrieved for him that first night, the ones he'd carried with him every day since. "I've been having dreams about Lily," he said quietly. "She told me I was being an idiot, that what happened to her wasn't your fault, and that punishing you for it was just another way of avoiding my own guilt." "Guilt about what?" "About not being there when she needed me. About being so focused on building my career that I missed the signs that she was sick. About failing her the way I accused you of failing her." Julian's hands trembled as he held out the gloves. "She was right about everything, and I was wrong about everything." Danielle stared at the gloves for a long moment before slowly reaching out to take them. Their fingers brushed, and Julian felt the familiar electricity, tempered now by sorrow and hard-won wisdom. "I found something," she said quietly, pulling an envelope from her purse. "In my mother's things. She wrote it before she died." With shaking hands, she opened the letter and read, "My darling girl, if someone makes you feel alive again, don't run from it. Wait for them, fight for them, because love, real love, is worth every risk, every heartbreak, every moment of fear. Don't let pride steal your chance at happiness." Julian felt tears burning behind his eyes. "Danielle, I can't go back to where we were," she said softly. "Too much has been said, too much has been broken. But maybe—" She looked up at him, and he saw a glimmer of the woman who'd captivated him that first night on the platform. "Maybe we could start over. Maybe we could try to be the people we are now, instead of the people our pain made us." Julian stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to remember what hope felt like. "Hi," he said quietly, extending his hand. "I'm Julian Maddox. I'm a man who's made terrible mistakes, who's carrying grief I don't know how to let go of, who's learning that healing isn't something you do alone." Danielle looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before slowly, carefully placing hers in it. "I'm Danielle Brooks," she replied, her voice steady and strong. "I'm a woman who saves lives for a living, who believes in second chances, who knows that sometimes the most broken people can help heal each other." As their hands joined beneath the ancient oak, Julian felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and guilt he'd carried for 10 years. In the distance, Maya and Carmen watched with cautious optimism, understanding that some stories don't end with the first heartbreak, but begin again with the courage to forgive. The gloves lay forgotten on the ground between them, no longer symbols of what divided them, but reminders of how far they'd traveled to find their way back to each other. Sometimes, Julian thought as he looked into Danielle's eyes, the universe gives you exactly what you need, even when you're not brave enough to ask for it, even when you don't think you deserve it, even when you've almost lost it forever. The end. Thanks for watching to the end. Did you like the story? Tell us what you thought in the comments below. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe now for more exciting stories you won't want to miss. Activate the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. See you in the next story. See you there.